said right at the beginning of the discussion that meaning wasn't a proposition.
That's right.
Right? And I would say, well, one form of meaning is propositional. That's the orderly meaning. But the transcendent form of meaning, upon which even order depends, is the dynamic meaning making.
But that's what I meant.
Yeah, I know, I understand that.
That's what I was trying to convey with this notion that I think is completely accessible to current cognitive science of our this evolving relation. I mean, because one of the key ideas of the Darwinian model is you integrate, you have the chaos, right? You have the opening up of the variations, often due to mutation and random events. And then you have natural selection, that is the ordering, that's the selection process. And then what evolution means is exactly this constant interplay between them. And that's what I meant when I think cognition is not a set of beliefs in our head. It's the brain's ongoing evolved fittedness to the world.
So John, I wanted to start a little bit left field, and it's been something I've been thinking about for the past year. I really wanted to get your take on it. Since I was in high school, I was reading a bit of philosophy and a little bit of psychology, trying to kind of like outthink problems, outthink the meaning problem, outthink anxiety. And in the past year, something changed in me where I had this one thought and I couldn't get it out of my head. And that thought is ignorance bliss? And I've been thinking about it for a year straight, and I don't necessarily like my current answer, but I wanted to start left field and get your thoughts on that question.
Well, that's a complex question to answer because I don't think there's a yes or no answer to it, which I guess is to be expected when you ask a scientist something. Because I think the central ability of your cognition is a process I call relevance realization, which is the following thing. The amount of information available to me in the environment is overwhelming, combinatorial explosive. The amount of information I have in my long-term memory, I mean, have you ever met anybody whose memory was full? Right? It's overwhelming. Think of all the possible combinations. You can combine, a rhinoceros with a Roman army and, right, all kinds of strange things. And then you think of all the possible sequences of actions you could perform. All of those things are combinatorial explosive, but this is what you do. And this is what we're finding very hard to give to artificial intelligence. Out of all the information, you zero in on the information you're going to pay attention to. You make the appropriate actions. You dig up the appropriate things from long-term memory. Now, do you do it perfectly? No, there's really good reasons why you can't do it perfectly. But do you do it really well such that you can solve a vast number of problems in a vast number of domains? You sure do. So you zero in on relevant information like that. Now, this isn't what you do. This is not what you do. You don't check each piece of information and go, nope, that's irrelevant, that's irrelevant, that's irrelevant. What you do is you don't check it. Somehow, and this sounds almost like a Zen koan, you intelligently ignore most of the information. So sort of at the fundamentals of your cognition, being able to ignore well is actually crucial to being an intelligent agent. So at that level, that's good, right? You need that. You need ignorance. For similar arguments, you need forgetting. But here's the problem. You pay a heavy price for that. Because when you're biased in your attention on some things as relevant, you are ignoring other things. And it turns out a lot of the times, right, you're actually ignoring needed information. You'll be able to catch yourself on that sometimes. You ever had an aha moment where you go, oh, aha, I've been thinking about this the wrong way. I thought the base of the triangle was important, but it's not. All that matters, something like that happens because you realize that you've treated the wrong information as relevant. Now, what this is just the tip of an iceberg of a larger point, which is the very processes of ignoring that make you intelligent and adaptive also make you perpetually vulnerable to self-deception. And self-deceptive behavior is self-destructive. And so to the degree to which you're ignorant of your self-deception is the degree to which you're ignorant and imprisoned by your self-destructive behavior. And at that level, you don't want to be ignorant, right? So the knack, part of what it is to be wise, I would argue, or at least to be rational, is to get the right balance between ignoring and paying enough attention so that you can self-correct, so that you can ameliorate as much of that self-deception as possible.
I wonder, because I've read some studies, and they might have been faulty studies, that people in high IQ brackets have higher depression numbers, anxiety, or alcohol substance abuse. And that's kind of where the base of my question comes from. But beyond IQ, I just wonder
Yes.
about those who are curious are almost cursed to a lower standard of happiness.
Well, there's an intervening variable, and I don't think the studies are flawed. And that has to do with the fact that your capacity for intelligence is what I just described, is that capacity for being a general problem solver. But that's not the same thing as your capacity for being rational. Your capacity for being rational is your capacity to be aware of those patterns of self-deception and overcome them. So there is no contradiction. In fact, the best evidence we have, and there's a lot of it, and it's robust and it replicates, is that intelligence correlates with measures of rationality at about 0.3. So it's a necessary but very far from sufficient condition. So there's no contradiction in being highly intelligent and being highly self-deceived and highly self-destructive. There's no contradiction there. Now, if you take a look at people who have cultivated rationality, or even more rarely, wisdom, they tend to do generally better on meaning in life scores than people who don't do that.
Wow. I guess this also leads me into another left question. These weren't prepared at all, as you can tell, was that the curiosity, to me, at least my theory growing up, was that religion is necessary for certain levels of peace to help with existential crisis. I always felt like people who were deeply religious potentially had a higher quality of life. I could be wrong. And my concern is those who are curious inevitably can't get back into the world of religion. And that was another part of the deeply curious. You keep asking why. I even remember going to church as a child, and every why question led me further away from what I was being taught. The curiosity and religion issue is kind of another thought that just came.
Well, let me reply to that again by making a distinction. And there's a big distinction to be made, and I think Fuller's right about this, between curiosity and wonder. So curiosity is when you have a gap in your knowledge, you're ignorant, and you seek to fill it. And if you don't fill it, it becomes aversive. So if I give you a detective novel and you never can get to the end, that gets very, very aversive for you. You start to hate it. You prolong. I want to know who did it, right? Now that's very different from wonder. Wonder is a state in which you call yourself and the way you're looking at the world, you call your framing of your identity and the world's identity into question. And notice if that deepens, it becomes a very positive state, which is awe. And there's increasing evidence that awe increases your cognitive flexibility. It's one of the few experiences we have where our sense of self diminishes and we experience that as positive. It's very similar to the flow state. In fact, I would argue that insight, flow, and awe are all on a continuum. Now, if you can't push that forever, because then you'll get horror. If you think of religion as answering the curiosity why questions, I think it's largely not going to satisfy you. If you think of religion as deepening questions so that you get to awe, so that you can experience fundamental transformations, such that you can overcome yourself in certain ways, self-transcendence, then I think you'll get a different kind of answer. Well, you're not going to get a proposition, but what you're going to get is the provocation of certain kinds of transformative experiences that are conducive not to knowledge, which is about overcoming ignorance, but to wisdom, which is about overcoming self-deception. So there's a big difference there. And there's increasing evidence. One of my RAs has done some really good evidence that people within a religious tradition then tend to do better in cultivating wisdom than people from a purely secular tradition. But, and this is an important but, no one of the religious traditions seems to have any particular advantage. They all seem to be about the same, which means it's not so much their dogmas and their propositions that are responsible. It's much more those provocations of insight and awe and self-transformation that seem to be crucial.
Is the experience of awe, can that be felt when you come to something, your curiosity brings you to something that you will not have an answer for, the big questions where there is no easy one-step answer? Does that lead to awe and acceptance in a sense?
It depends what mode you're in. There's sort of two modes we have. This goes back to Fromm, but it also overlaps with Michael Apter's work on metamotivational states. Fromm talked about two different existential modes we're in. There's a having mode, and this is a mode that is that is configured around having needs. These are needs that are met by having something, like having water, having food, having shelter, and having sex. We even say having sex, right? And then the being mode, I don't really like that name, but I sort of get the point of it. But these are needs that are met by going through a developmental process. So I need to be mature. I need to be honest. I need to be in love. So curiosity is in the having mode. And if you get to an unanswerable question in the having mode, what you feel is a tremendous lack of something that you need to have. But if you meet an unanswerable question in the being mode, so it confronts you not as a problem that you can't solve, which is threatening and frustrating, but as a mystery that calls you to become something more than you are, then that unanswerable question could lead you in. As Socrates said, wisdom begins in wonder. It can lead you into the pursuit of wisdom. So it depends what existential mode you're at. This corresponds to like what are called the telic and the paratelic mode. A telic mode is when you're working towards a goal, right? And so the value of what comes in the goal. You're in the telic mode if you would like a shortcut. So, for example, brushing my teeth for me is perfectly telic. If you could say, here's a shortcut so you don't have to spend 5 minutes doing that, man, would I take it. The paratelic mode is you set up a goal or an end state, but you're doing the activity for its own sake. So, like if I'm making love to someone, I don't want to get to the end very rapidly. If you said to me, here's a shortcut, so you can get out of it, you can get it done. No, I don't want that. That's not what I want. And so, right, if you're in the mode where you're not asking the question because you need to get to the answer and the goal, but you're asking the question because the process itself is inherently valuable to you, the stepping back, the opening up, the making yourself available to awe, then that can happen.
So I found your work, and I'm sure a lot of the people that are going to click this and listen to the audio because of the meaning crisis. And when I hear the meaning crisis, I immediately think a crisis is something that is happening currently, this year, this decade. But I was curious, is that accurate, or have humans, because of human nature and in human history, always struggled in some ways with a meaning crisis?
Well, there are perennial problems. I mean, there's perennial problems due to what you could call human nature. As I mentioned, the very processes that make us adaptive make us perennially susceptible to self-deception, self-destruction. And then what that does is that, you see, when that adaptive relation becomes maladaptive, that's not just sort of a functional consequence. The things that make people experience meaning in life, that their lives are worth living, are those sort of connections to themselves, to each other in the world. And so when those adaptive connections get malformed through self-deception, meaning in life also goes down. So that's a perennial threat. So there's a perennial threat to human beings that they can fall into despair, they can experience absurdity, etc. However, there's something deeper when I say the meaning crisis than those perennial threats. Because there have also been perennial responses to the perennial threats. People have come up with ecologies of practices for intervening in their cognition to ameliorate the self-deception and to enhance that sense of those connections that makes meaning in life. That's what I mean when I say wisdom. Now, what I mean by the meaning crisis is the following. That ecology of practices, right, it has to be homed. It has to be situated in a worldview that gives it, that validates it, that gives it guides, gives it institutions. And what's happened for what we broadly call the West is we've lost our wisdom institutions. We've lost our wisdom guides. We've lost the sense of wisdom for a bunch of historical reasons. And what that means is you can do the following, and I do this often with my students. I'll say, where do you go from information? Oh, the internet, blah, 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 blah. Where do you go for knowledge? Well, science, history, although they're a little bit more, questioning about that, but generally. And then I ask them, well, where do you go for wisdom? And there's a silence. Wisdom isn't optional. Oh, here's the ivory tower academic talking about wisdom. Wisdom isn't optional because foolishness is inevitable. And if you don't want to reduce foolishness, then you're unlike any other human being I've ever met. And so people cannot just, I won't cultivate. So what they do is they struggle. They come up with distraction techniques, or they try to cultivate wisdom, and they cobble together little in an autodidactic fashion, fragmented practices of trying to ameliorate this. And then they might bubble chamber that or echo chamber that on the internet. And then social media actually can exacerbate this rather than making it better. That's what I mean by the meaning crisis. I mean the fact that people we are suffering. We have this information feast that is paired and is enhancing a wisdom famine, and we are starving from it without even realizing. But you can see the symptoms everywhere. You can see the symptoms in the increase in suicide, the diagnosis of anxiety, depression, the addiction crises, the loneliness crisis. There was a poll in the UK in 2017. I think it was something like 89% of people said their lives were meaningless, and that predicts all kinds of deleterious mental health issues. You can see it with people sort of retreating into the virtual world, a world that is, doesn't really afford genuine meaning, but gives surrogates. But you can also see positive symptoms. You can see like the rise of the mindfulness movement, people returning to a revival of stoicism, et cetera, as a way of trying to bring back wisdom traditions that will help address this issue. The problem facing those is that right now, those practices don't jive very well with our current scientific worldview. And that tends to undermine them. And people think of them as woo-woo or illegitimate, or just self-deceptive. And so a big chunk of my work is to try and study wisdom and mindfulness and, all these other processes that people go through and give them a scientific foundation, meaning in life, all this kind of, so that we can resituate these practices within a scientific worldview and help further the communities that are emerging to try and address this hunger.
This is a very basic question with a lot of obvious answers, but why do humans require these conversations? Why do we require meaning when every other animal seems to do just fine surviving? I'm sure there's some obvious answers, but it's a big question.
Well, I mean, there's one sense in which all animals, at least all the ones we want to easily attribute cognition to, do have meaning. This is one of the problems with behaviorism. Let me just show you at a level, a very basic level. So if you see the yellow flame, you'll run from the room. If you smell the smoke from the fire, you'll run from the room. If I yell fire, you'll run from the room. Those are all very different physical events, and yet you do the same thing. Well, why do you do the same thing? Because they mean the same thing to you. They're relevant to you in the same way. And all organisms face that problem I said earlier about zeroing in on the relevant information. And they all face problems of getting misled by how they do it. Now, we just happen to be particularly intelligent on one hand, and we also we don't keep the meaning just in our head, so to speak. We share it culturally, and we rely on it. We rely on what's called cultural ratcheting. You and I don't have to start from scratch like most organisms. We can rely on all of the accumulated knowledge and wisdom from our culture. So we don't have to start from scratch. So we're more intelligent, which means we need much more meaning. And then that's magnified tremendously by the fact that we're inherently cultural creatures that have to rely on cultural systems. And what is culture? Well, culture is a system of meaning. It's a way of organizing practice. It's a way of organizing, right, behavior, etc., so that we share patterns of what we deem relevant or important or salient. So this means that for us, because our primary adaptations are wicked intelligence and culture, meaning is simultaneously more important for us and more at risk for us. And because we are also rational creatures, because we have the capacity, because we need to be able to reflect on our intelligence and on our culture to see how it's, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes causing us to misframe things. So we are reflective, we are self-corrective, and we are working very, very hard to preserve those connections that are needed for us to zero in on relevant information in an intelligent and a culturally appropriate fashion. So it matters to us. I mean, other than your naked body and the atmosphere you're in, everything else you're doing is based on cultural systems of meaning and your ongoing intelligence zeroing in on the relevant information right now. And if you don't monitor that, because it's very complex and very self-organizing, there's a lot of ways in which it can go seriously wrong.
What are your thoughts on Becker's book, The Denial of Death, if you're familiar with it? What do you think his take is on our projects that we create as a denial for the inevitable?
Well, I mean, I think the book is important. I think it's simplistic in the sense that it offers one explanation for too much. So it's interesting. It suffers from a bit of ethnocentrism, right? So I know enough through practice and reading, of some Eastern traditions, Buddhist traditions, and Hindu traditions, in which people have a horror of immortality. And part of the practices are to get people to become aware of how horrific immortality is. And the idea is you get that balances off whatever horror you might have for your mortality. And you get to a state where it becomes less and less important to you. I don't know, therefore, how broadly, is everybody doing everything because they're trying to deny their mortality? I'm sure that applies to a significant number of people, but the evidence seems to be pretty clear that people care more about meaning than they do about life, because they'll kill themselves if they don't have meaning, which seems hard to explain if meaning is just some stand-in for, prolonging one's life.
It's very interesting how you brought up cultures that are afraid of immortality. And I'm a Canadian, and I'm also young, so I see this movement of like biohacking and longevity research and all these popular figures talking about we're going to live to 280. And as you were saying that, it just reminded me that I'm kind of in a bubble here in Canada, and I haven't realized how culturally different things are, and how where our most popular podcasters are talking about trying to live to 200, while other cultures are reminding you how terrible that could be.
Yeah, I don't want to claim too much. I don't want to claim like that I won't step out of the way of a car that's moving towards me or something instinctive like that. But I've done enough Stoic and Buddhist practice that my default state is I don't want to live very long. I like the prospect of the foolishness and the things that I've done that I regret piling up for thousands of years, and me inevitably falling out of love with all the people I love, because I know, how could love last for thousands of years? How is such an immortality? So for my immortality is I would have to not be able to change very much. Because even if I'm changing a little bit over 1,000 years, I'm going to be a totally different person in 1,000 or 2,000 years. I'm not going to be this John. So this John disappears. So I don't know. then I think like Epicurus is like, what is it? I mean, I can't be afraid of not existing because I can't know that I don't exist. I can never experience that. That is not an experience I can have. Right? And so it's like, well, you're going to die. Well, I've been getting older since, 30 years of age, and I'm now going to be 60. And, there's crappy parts about that. But if you were to ask me right now, do you want to go back to being 20? No way. No way. Sorry, I'm not insulting you or anything, but I don't want to go back. And so I'm not quite sure what it is people longing for. I fear we're falling prey to something Wittgenstein often pointed out. We confuse a picture with a proposition. We sort of imagine ourselves for a brief period of time in some wonderful place. And that's what immortality would be like. It's like, no. That's a picture. That does not have all the essential properties of immortality. So I think there's wisdom in these Eastern practices that get you to realize, wait, if you're going to do it, really, really imagine it. Like imagine it really thoroughly, rationally, probabilistically, and all of the consequences. And notice what you're requiring. Do you want to be immortal and all your friends and your family aren't? No, they need to be immortal. Well, then all their friends and family need to be immortal. And soon what you need to be, the whole world has to be immortal. And all the organisms on the planet, and then everything has to freeze and never change. And that sounds like hell to me. So that's the kind of thing you need to do, I think.
It's super interesting hearing you say that you wouldn't want to go back to 20. And I could already hear 50% of the audience being horrified, the other 50% saying, wow, that was beautifully put. And it does show that there are major differences in people, even in our own country and in our culture, with their views on life, meaning, and death. They're very, very different. It's almost politically how polarized some people are to a statement like not wanting to go back to 20.
Well, it's also a psychological fact. It's called the temporal horizon. So until you hit about 40, 45, most people live from their birth. They live from their birth. But once you pass that mark, and it varies for people, but it always happens, you flip. And instead of living from your birth, you live towards your death. And that's a very different orientation. When you're living from your birth, the thought of just extending that growth forever just seems, yeah, of course. When it flips, it's like, do I want to go on forever? And like I said, if that really means, do I want everybody else and everything else to go on forever? And do I want to stay the way I am? Do I want to become a totally different person so that this John doesn't exist anymore? How is that any different from death? So those are the things you start asking yourself.
Whenever I think about really, really tough questions and ideas like we're talking about here, like I've talked about on my podcast or researched in private, I wonder if in my 20s, where I am right now, that was the time where I was best prepared to start engaging and fighting with these ideas, or if this should have been something that was foundational as a child. I wonder if conversations of meaning should have been in my household or in preschool, and if that would have made things a little easier, because there's a lot of kids my age going to college, mid-20s, that face these big questions, and it causes a lot of fear. It causes this anxiety and this angst. Do you think maturity is necessary and you shouldn't start thinking about big questions until you're of age? Or is it ethical for parents or even elementary school teachers to have different versions of meaning questions? There is, hey, death happens. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Is it unethical or ethical to have it?
So I usually follow Plato on most things, but here's where Plato thought we shouldn't let people do these things until they had got all kinds of training, and then when they were 30, they could start. Maybe I'll come back to why he said that, because there's some wisdom in that. But I think it's Gareth Matthews who does philosophy with the young child, and there's practices you can do with younger children to sort of waken wonder and help them distinguish it from curiosity, and let them sort of start exploring things and begin reflection. And then Stephen Law has a bunch of books, the Philosophy Files, the Philosophy Gym, that you can use with, and I've used them when I've taught high school courses on philosophy, and I introduced them to, philosophical thought. And then I teach 20-somethings at university, and they're hungry for this stuff. Now, I do think that in addition to exposing them to philosophical discourse and philosophical questioning, we should also be training children, and we're not, in how to be more rational, how to be more reflective. We just assume that intelligence is rationality, and rationality is logicality, and those are somehow all identical, and they're all very different from each other, by the way. And then we just said, I think Zach Stein is right about this. We've forgotten what education is supposed to be, but education is about the market. No, it's not. That's absolute bullshit. The point about education is cultural ratcheting. The point about education is one generation affording the next generation a better platform so that it has to learn less, right? That it has to start even less from scratch. That's the point of education. The point of education is to keep cultural ratcheting going. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't get training for a job or something like that. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying we have made that exclusive. And what that means is we have become literally short-sighted in how we're understanding education. If we're understanding education as the project, not even of making people good citizens. We used to think that, and we've sort of let that sort of drift away, and our democracy might be suffering because of that. But something deeper, that education is about making somebody that specific kind of cultural entity that we call a person. And we used to have, religions that did this for us. I'm not advocating for religion here, but for most people, that's fallen away. And so we don't have a place. And when I was young, I was brought up in religion. You went to Sunday school and you were taught these things and there was kind of brilliance in the design of things. They figured out a way. They had centuries of practice of how to take big questions and put them in a form that could appeal to children, and then you would slowly ratchet it up as time went on. And so I think we should be teaching kids a bunch of skills and virtues, how to properly look for cognitive bias, how to step back and perform an act of mindfulness, how to get better at taking other people's perspectives. Now, I don't think we can do too much with children before 11 or 12 years of age because they just don't have enough. I think we can do some of what Gareth Matthews talks about with philosophy of the young children. But as soon as they get into what Piaget called formal operations, then I think we can start teaching them some more advanced things, as well as exposing them more and more to philosophical wonder, philosophical discourse. And we don't do that. We don't.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I really wish at a younger age I was faced with some of these questions, not graduating high school in my mid-20s, coming face to face with some really big questions that I wish I might have had a teacher or a professor or a mentor guide me through instead of finding YouTube videos or a book. Yeah. We brought up religion earlier and just now, and my thoughts on religion being the most surefire pill for meaning has been something I've carried for a long time. I remember being incredibly young, having to go to Sunday school, and the moment I started being a little too curious and having conflicts with the idea of religion was almost some of the most traumatic moments of my preteens or childhood, having these moments where for 12 years you are sure of something you are told in the household every Sunday. And the moment it was almost a traumatic moment. And ever since, every day now you battle the meaning question. Is it fair to say that still to this day, religion is the most reliable source of giving a human a sense of meaning?
Well, it depends. It depends what you mean. Remember what I said, the research showing it's not the particular beliefs of the religion that seem to be making the difference. And there's lots of stuff that converges on that. And there's research showing that religion is good for you unless you're in sort of a more fundamentalist form of religion. Then it tends to be sort of harmful for you. And of course, there's going to be people that are just going to disagree with me on principle on that. But once we agree on the measures, we agree on the measures and we take them, and that's what comes out. So if see and this is part of what the meaning crisis is. We have equated religion to belief, to having beliefs. Notice the language, to having beliefs rather than becoming a particular kind of person. And so we've overemphasized belief, and we've sort of been infected by the Cartesian project of trying to get certainty, even though our science and our philosophy have basically told us that is a project we have to stop trying to do. It's not going to be found. And so, this sense of gathering together beliefs that I will assert no matter what, which has become a predominant mode for some forms of religion, that isn't going to be conducive to everything I've been talking about. Because when I'm talking about things like wisdom, I'm not talking about that propositional knowing. I'm not talking about acquiring or having propositions that you assert is true. I'm talking about acquiring skills. I'm talking about acquiring states of mind, perspectives. I'm talking about transforming your identity in a powerful way. And so I talk about different kinds of knowing. And insofar as religion has suffered, as our culture as a whole has suffered, in reducing all of the knowing to the propositional knowing of having beliefs and left out all these other kinds of knowing, it's not going to be of much help. Because here's the main idea. Those other kinds of knowing, what I call the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory, those are the ones that are doing almost all of the work in creating a sense of meaning, a sense of connection, a sense of being fitted to the world in a way that gives you a sense of belonging, a sense of what to do, how things make sense to you, what's appropriate behavior, how to see through self-deception, how to cultivate wisdom. So I think the answer on religion is very mixed. I think there are forms of religion and there are people within it, and I've met them and I get to talk to them, which is a great pleasure, that are conducive to the cultivation of wisdom and meaning. But a lot of religion isn't. The religion that I grew up in was a very fundamentalist form of Christianity. It was very much about this willful assertion of beliefs as if they were certain regardless of evidence or argument. And that was very traumatizing to me in many ways. So if I think of a religion goes down that pathway, I think it's ultimately not going to be helpful. So I don't know if religion per se is the answer anymore. I'm very concerned with the nuns, the NONES. These are people who do not belong to any organized religion. And for very, very good historical and other reasons, they generally find organized religions irrelevant or even threatening. And I'm trying to understand how can we afford communities, ecologies, and practices for these people so they can address the serious symptoms and the deleterious effects of the meaning crisis in their lives.
There was a moment in an interview I watched of yours where I kind of had an aha moment where you talked about life being a series of fixation, intense fixation, then intense distraction, and then fixation, and then distraction. And at least my interpretation of that was that meaning is, there is no meaning to someone's life. There are days of meaning, seasons of meaning, weeks of meaning, moments of meaning, because you're fixated on a meaning and then you're distracted by a new meaning. Was that an accurate interpretation, or did I just butcher your interview?
No, there's no butchering going on. I mean, there's 2 points in there that I think are very good. One is, and this is a standard distinction in the literature, there's a distinction between meaning in life and the meaning of life, right? Meaning in life is those moments that you find meaningful, significant, that make your life worth living, even though you inevitably experience suffering and distress. That's meaning in life. That's different from the meaning of life. The meaning of life is generally connotes that there's some sort of cosmic or divine plan, something you're supposed to be doing, right? There's some grand purpose that you need to achieve. And for various reasons, I think the second that the meaning of life is just a confused idea. I don't. Well, anyways, it's not what people typically are talking about when they talk about how meaningful their lives are. They're talking about meaning in life. Let's talk about that thing that you mentioned about attention, because notice what it's doing. There's these two pulls on your attention. There's this, like you said, there's the fixation, and people are probably listening, they're even experiencing it. Your mind wants to wander, it wants to be distracted, it wants to go out, and then there's a pressure that brings it back in, and then it goes out. Now, part of what I've argued in many places is that that's very analogous to the process of evolution. So in evolution, there is variation in the population, and then there's scarcity, and most of the options get killed off. So there's variation and selection, and then from what is selected, you revary, and then you reselect, and then you revary and reselect. What you can see with your attention is your attention is a self-organizing process. And what it's constantly doing is it's constantly evolving what is salient, what stands out for you, what is foregrounded, what is backgrounded. And that ongoing, right, it's that ongoing, there's an evolution that's leading to a sort of continuity of contact. You feel that you're appropriately gripping the world in a cognitive and existential sense. And it's not so much that there's a final state any more than there's a final state of being adaptive. Meaning is an ongoing, evolving relationship between the dynamics of an organism and the dynamics of its environment, just like adaptivity. Like, is a great white shark adapted? Well, yeah, if it's in the ocean and it can swim around, but if you put it in the Sahara Desert, it dies. So, right, just like adaptivity, meaning is not about a state. Meaning is about this continuity of contact so that you continually are able to be a general problem solver, connect to the world, connect to yourself, connect to other people in a way so that you can solve problems, achieve goals, and continue to live your life. And you may say, well, what's the point of all that? Well, at some point, no matter what you posit, you'll do this. Oh, well, it's the point of everything is to get to heaven. And then when you get there, what's the point? Well, the point is to worship God. Well, why should you do that? Well, you just should, because it's intrinsically valuable. Well, it looks like what people find intrinsically valuable are two things. They want to be connected to the world, themselves and other people, so that they have an inner peace. The parts of their psyche, their mind and their body are harmonious, are not in conflict, are ripping each other apart in self-deceptive, self-destructive patterns. They want peace of mind. But they also want whatever is making them, right, achieve this peace to be real. They don't want it to be the result of an illusion or deception. That's why if you ask people, would you like to know, are you in a happy romantic relationship? Yes. Would you like to know if your partner's cheating on you? Yes, I would. Even though that will destroy the relationship, because you don't want it to be an illusion. And so I think, right, if you think of meaning in life as that evolving connectedness that synchronizes and coordinates inner peace with contact with reality, so they're mutually supporting each other, that life is intrinsically valuable. It's intrinsically worth living. This was Plato's argument, and I think it still stands up today.
It sounds like you wouldn't have an answer for this, but has there ever been a philosopher or a book you've read or a friend or a professor that attempted to answer what is the meaning of life, not in an adequate way, but in a way where you at least said, oh, wow, that's incredibly interesting and made me think?
No, I guess. I mean, that, and I don't want to come off as arrogant or hubristic. When I studied the great people, like, and the people who have had the most sort of profound mystical experiences, they generally come back saying there ultimately isn't like a grand purpose. It's all, you get to a state where you like think about it. When you really love someone, what's that for? Like, what's its point? What's it for? It's not for anything. In fact, if you think it's for something, you're kind of misunderstanding what love is, right? You're using the person, you're manipulating them. But when you're in love, you're not trying to have something. You're trying to be. You're trying to be in love, and you're trying to afford that person being in love and coming to develop through love, and you develop, and the two are coupled together, and you want it to be real. All the things I'm talking about, and then when you talk to when I read the mystic, the people who've had the greatest experiences that they can report while they're still alive, they get to a state where they've fallen so deeply in love with being that they've lost all sense of, what's it all for? It's like, I think, what is it? Is it Angiosolitis? A follower of Eckhart. The rose blooms without any why. It's beautiful just because it is, right? And Heidegger wrote quite a bit of work around that. And what's interesting about that is that actually lines up with some of the research. Meaning in life, I mean, our culture tends to equate it to purpose because that makes us work harder, and that helps us to make the lives of rich people better for them, or something like this. Now, purpose matters; it's important to meaning in life, but it's only one of four factors, and it's not the most important factor, right? You need coherence. Your world can't be absurd; it has to make sense to you. Significance; it's got to be real. It has to have it has to have a deep value, a meaning to you. And mattering. You need to feel connected, relevant to something bigger than yourself that has a reality and a value independent of your egocentric concerns. That's why people have kids. People when you have a kid, your wealth goes down, your health goes down, your longevity goes down, by the way. You want to shave years off your life, have a kid. Right? You're exposed to more pathogens, you're exposed to more stress, all kinds of things. Your relationships are hampered. Your sense of subjective well-being goes down because you're tired, you're hungry, and you're always, there's the alarm bells of the kid crying going off, and you and your partner are really all both thinking the other person needs to work harder, and there's simmering tension, and all that's going on. And you ask people, well, why do you have a kid? And they tell, it makes my life more meaningful. Because when you have a child, you have to make this flip if you're going to be a good parent. I'm not claiming to be a great parent. My kids say I'm a good parent, so, right? But you can't live in terms of how things matter to you. You have to live in terms of how you matter to the child. You convert, metanoia. You completely turn the direction of your relevance realization machinery. Well, what's the point of having a kid? Like, well, there is no point. You're making a person. And what could be more important than that? Well, what's the grand cosmic purpose of persons? There is none, right? But I happen to experience persons as intrinsically valuable, and a universe with persons in it is better than a universe without persons in it. And if you ask me why, I can't tell you any more than I can tell you how to be honest if you're not capable of being honest, or even more, or telling you how to be rational if you're incapable of some primary rationality, right? These are things that you ultimately have to accept as part of the fiber of your being.
I really enjoy conversations like this because language really matters, and you go in depth, and you've accepted that, hey, no, if you want to ask a question, there are many ways it could go, but we need to clarify this and this and this, and there are no easy questions in the questions I'm trying to answer and that we're all trying to answer. So out of curiosity, I wanted to ask your opinion on the modern self-help guru genre. It's incredibly popular. A lot of young people, I'm sure a lot of your students, a lot of my listeners are buying these very oversimplified $12 books that guarantee peace. And just hearing you talk versus hearing some gurus on YouTube talk, you could tell that either these people are geniuses with their way of simplifying impossible ideas, or that this is possibly harmful for young people to follow. So what are your thoughts on the mainstream self-help genre? Is it helpful or is it hurtful for people like me or our listeners?
I think the majority of these books are not based on good science or good history or good philosophical reflection. Three things you should always be making good use of when you consider where you're going to go to for the cultivation of wisdom. And so many of these books, remember when I talked about brushing your teeth? And you can tell you're in the having mode because you're willing to take a shortcut. You can't have wisdom. That's why the ancient word is philia sophia. You love wisdom. You fall in love with it the way you fall in love with a person. And think about, if you were to say, I need the shortcut to how to get to know Takis. I need the shortcut so I can get there really quick and be finished and be done with it. So I don't have to learn anything more with him. I don't have to become, I don't have to actually cultivate a virtuous friendship with him. I just want to, come on, you go, wow, whew, really? You don't get people. And like, you might even think I'm evil if I talk that way, because it sounds like I have like a really, manipulative view of you and an overinflated view of myself. But that's basically what a lot of the self-help books are telling you. Here's the 4 steps to wisdom. It's like, no, I'm sorry. That's like saying what I said. That's like you are trying to deal with a human being living with other human beings. This is incredibly complex and difficult. And you have to do it within the being mode. You can't. This is not about having acquired certain beliefs. Look, if acquiring beliefs was all we needed, we wouldn't need therapy. People go into therapy with the right belief, often the correct beliefs. I'm suffering too much. I don't treat people the way I should. They give all the right propositions, but that's not what they need. What they need is a process of transformation. They need, they need a way of life. And ways of life can't be reduced to just sentences or propositions. Like, a way of life is ultimately something that has to be exemplified in people and in the community over periods of time, engaging in complex ecologies of practices that deal with the complexity of reality, the complexity of people, and the complexity of the relationships between people. I'm sorry, but I have a very dim view of most of the self-help books. I mean, the best could be said of them is, there's a very good chance you're wasting your time. And David Hume said, we fall into evil not when we pursue evil, but when we pursue a lesser good rather than a greater good. And wasting your time when you have precious little of it to devote to wisdom, cultivation, and meaning realization, it is harmful. And then secondly, I think these books often they foster delusion. They give people a false sense. And compare to the diet industry, because they're very similar. They have very similar ways of marketing, very similar appeal. What's the success rate of a diet? 5%. 95% recidivism rate, which means within 2 years of the diet, people are back to the weight they were at before they took the diet. Reliably. And yet the diet industry, billions of dollars. Some of these diets are harmful to people. We know they are. Man, I wish I had that. I wish I only had to succeed in 5% of what I do, and people would give me tons of money, right? And it's the same kind of thing. The self-help is a substitute for the harder spiritual, philosophical, and existential work people need to go through. The fundamental and often difficult transformations they need to go through in order to deal with the perennial threats of self-deception, despair, absurdity, anguish, alienation, brokenheartedness.
That was very well put, and it's been something I've been thinking about for a really long time. I had on one side, I thought, hey, if my friends are reading these books, maybe in a couple years they'll be ready to take a leap to some more challenging questions or books or engage with people like you. But on the other, I worried that it would create a bit of delusion, and I haven't really come to a conclusion on that, but it's very concerning how popular and how large that market share is. The numbers are insane. The seminars are growing. And I worry that it might be hurting more people than it's helping. But I really agree with everything you said. But I just wanted to wrap up on one last question. The last year has been incredibly challenging and confusing. And as a deep thinker and as someone who examines what's going on around in society or within yourself, what is the biggest realization or lesson that has come from an incredibly painful year plus?
Well, Takas, I have to say that when COVID first struck, when I did some interviews, some on Rebel Wisdom, a couple other places, and I expressed concern. So remember I talked about you have to home ecology of practices, and people don't feel at home in the scientific worldview. That's called domicide, when you lose a sense of home. Porteous and Smith invented the term, and then Brian Walsh really talked about it. I talk about it in the book I wrote with Christopher Mastipietro and Philip Misovic. And so what COVID has done is it's accelerated the domicide in Western culture. People are even more lonely. Things seem even more absurd, don't make sense, even more chaotic. They feel even more cut off. They feel even more limited in how they can cultivate relationships and connections. And so I was concerned, and then also the virus is almost mythological. It's like an Old Testament deity. It's invisible. It demands a purity code. It can strike without warning. It kills you to no purpose. And so I was very concerned that this was the combination of this enhancement of the meaning crisis through more domicide and the kind of weird mindset people are being put into by the virus and the weird patterns of behavior would really be deleterious to mental health. We'd see a huge rise in conspiracy theories. That has turned out to be true. Jules Evans brilliantly talks about what he calls conspirituality. These forms like QAnon and others where spirituality and conspiracy theories are woven together in this really surprising, attractive but deleterious form. And so, I mean, I mean, scientists have to make predictions. So I don't mean to, this isn't I told you so, but I was sort of like saying, I think what we're going to see is much more of that. We're going to see an exacerbation of meaning issues. A lot of people are going to find the meaning of their life being really, really truncated, relationships being lost or threatened, sense of belonging being undermined, loneliness increasing, alienation, absurdity, mental health. I think we're starting to see it, and it's going to. We're facing a mental health tsunami that is just coming onto our radar screens right now. I think that's going to happen. Now, what that has done as the fire of the meaning crisis has got hotter, and many people are getting burned by it, some people, it has driven them to being responsive and reflective and coming up with ways to make the project of understanding meaning and cultivating wisdom central in their lives. So all kinds of online communities have sprung up, where people are cultivating wisdom in a philosophically and historically grounded fashion, even scientifically grounded in a lot of places. And these communities are growing. People are doing things. During COVID, I gave a daily online course on meditation and contemplation, moving practices, and then also that's like wisdom from the Eastern traditions, and then wisdom practices from the Western traditions, from Epicureanism, Stoicism, Neoplatonism, and that has germinated for a lot of people, and communities have formed up. And I'm not like, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be self-referential. Like lots of people are doing this and they're connecting with each other. So you see this weird bifurcation that for a huge number of people, this is really, really pounding them in ways they don't really fully understand. And this is not to insult them. It's because our culture doesn't have a good language for talking about meaning in life and doesn't afford ways in which you can reliably cultivate enhanced wisdom, connectedness, etc. And then on the other hand, people recovering, rediscovering, and reinventing new ecologies of practices, new communities, and new communities of communities, and they are springing up and growing. So I think we're at like a bifurcation point in the culture. I think it's dividing in some important ways. I think that's the most historically important thing that's going to come out of COVID.